Well, thank you for coming. We really appreciate it. Just to give you a little bit of our agenda, we're going to pretty much welcome. We have some questions for the panelists that we're going to go over. And then we have a Q&A from the attendees. So feel free to ask questions. That's what we want. And then we will talk about next steps and what that looks like. We have on the call with us today Robert Dawkins from Safe Coalition NC, and we have Reverend Glenn C. Redrick, the co-chair of the Charlotte Clergy Coalition for Justice. And please, you all introduce yourself if you would like to as well. We are happy to have you with us this evening.
Thank you. Go ahead, Reb.
Well, Ratrina did a good job. I am the co-chair for Charlotte Clergy Coalition for Justice. I'm also the founder of Speaking in the Key of We, which is a justice, I'll say a womanist justice broadcast that airs the first and third Fridays of the month. And we are dedicated, the show is dedicated now with making sure that we get 3 bills in the Senate passed. And so our focus will be lifting those up and talking about around the United States, other bills that are trying to suppress the vote of many citizens throughout the country. So, and I'm happy to be here tonight. I wear many other hats, but those are the 2 hats I'm gonna lift up tonight.
And as Ratrina said, my name is Robert Dawkins. I'm the political director for an organization called Action NC. And besides for being the political director of Action NC, which is divided up into different projects, I also chair our project for police accountability, which is called Safe Coalition. That stands for Safety, Accountability, Fairness, and Equity. And that's in partnership. Sometimes people get confused, so I'll be like, if you understand what the NAACP was, and then you understood that there was a separate piece that was the Moral Monday movement, which originally started being HKOJ, which brought in other partners. So it wasn't just a NAACP function. It's that same type of vein with Safe Coalition. So we're housed in Action NC, but our coalition is made up of not only just Action NC, but national partners.
In a meeting, right?
National partners like
hey, I can't do this right now. I'll do it afterwards.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
No, I just wanted to let you know.
Yeah, our national partners like Center for Popular Democracy and other groups that work on police accountability issues. And we started Action NC. We've been around since the Acorn days, around the early 2000s, and SAFE became police accountability part. We started doing that work around 2012.
All right.
I'm Ginny Sullivan, and I'm retired, so I'm not doing a lot of formal kinds of work, but I am the precinct chair of Precinct 87 for the Democratic Party, and as such, getting out the vote and that kind of thing is a major project. I do a geriatric case management for families, and so I'm not really retired, I guess. I'm having trouble doing that, but I also teach a class based on the works of Ibram Kendi, how to be an anti-racist, and a lot of what's in there is the policies that we have in place. He very much focuses on that. So I'm glad to be here.
Thank you all. Thank you for being here again. I want to say thank you for that. And we will get into some of our questions. So these questions will be for Robert and for Reverend Glenn C. Redrick. So just tell me about your work, the whole Police Accountable in Charlotte, like the work you have been doing here in Charlotte.
Okay, Reb, did you want to go first?
Well, I can go because I know Robert can provide more information, but through the Charlotte Clergy Coalition for Justice, we were very vocal. We did had a press release rally in front of the county building where we provided several demands that we wanted to see changed, and we communicated that to the mayor and the city council. From that, and I'm sure in concert with the work that Robert is doing, there was a task force put together where from the Charlotte Clergy Coalition for Justice, we had 2 of our members to sit on that board where they began to re-examine how our police department is made up in terms of its policies and procedures to bring about some recommendations to the city council. That is the work that we are doing. We also will continue to participate, not that we are looking forward to tragedies occurring, but when they do occur, we will constantly be before the city council and our state legislator sending a message. Just as we were with the death of Andrew Brown in Elizabeth City, we also, with the Poor People's Campaign, we partner with them to let them know that there are some egregious bills in our legislator that we want to see change. One in particular is how they handle providing the videos from the police cameras, and 2, not in all cities, but some cities are not as does not provide the openness or the ability for the state DAs to be called in to to do an investigation. So there, we are working in concert throughout, not only in Charlotte, Mecklenburg County, but throughout the state of North Carolina, and then even nationally, to draw attention to the fact that the way policing is done needs to be dismantled, restructured. I could come up with a whole bunch of other adjectives. It needs to be changed.
Definitely.
Thank you. Yeah. Go ahead, Robert.
So not much more to add after that with Reverend Rhetoric. She could just drop the mic. But we've been working on this from a policy side, and I think that people have to draw that there's 2 separate pieces to advocacy here and around the state. And there is the straight policy work, and then there is the activism and mobilization, and they feed off of both. So Charlotte, over the past, I'd say since Keith Lamont Scott has really found a big activism voice that it had not had in the previous years, since we've been working on police accountability since the early 2000s, and there was very little activism around it. It was just policy, which people consider boring. But the activism part really took off around Keith Lamont Scott, and since then it's led to the formation of lots of different groups doing advocacy work and activism work. And from that, we're able to at least get more eyes and more attention on policy changes that we would like to see done, knowing that policy is not the end all to be all, because without the activism, then it's harder for us to get the policy changed. And we also understand that the policy change is a constant battle. It's not something that you're going to go and pass a piece of policy and the fight's going to be over. So, we started work in 2012, mainly working on citizen oversight, and our main things we wanted to see there was police being able to be held accountable by a citizens review board, as opposed to just being held accountable internally. And Charlotte had a citizen review board since 1996, but it really didn't have much power. And we worked to make some changes, couldn't get everything that we wanted. We wanted subpoena power for the board, which we've never been able to get. That's something we have to get from the General Assembly. And we've, actually filed subpoena power bills for the state and for Charlotte specific ever since 2015. Every session we filed it, and we've never been able to make headway on. But what we were able to do was make some changes to the Citizen Review Board in its scope and its scale. We were able to change the board from where the only thing that the board would get and receive was a 2-page summary from the police department signed off on the chief saying this is the case and this is all you have to look at and listen to. We were able to change that now to where the board receives the entire internal affairs file on the case, and we were able to lower standard of review, which was while people talk subpoena power, standard of review was the larger issue because it was beyond a reasonable doubt, and that threshold was too high for a case to be brought before the Citizen Review Board. And secondly, it was too high of a standard for them to rule against an officer. So we, change the standard to preponderance of evidence, which now would make it the same level of standard that you would have to go to civil court to win something. So after that, we started seeing more cases actually come before the Citizens Review Board, but still we didn't have the right makings on the board. The board was extremely top heavy with stakeholders, specifically not a reflection of the community. So we went back and made some more changes. We changed the board to where now city and county employees or formal employees, specifically police officers or city employees, cannot serve on the board. And we fixed the requirement now, instead of it just being an appointment by city council, that the candidates have to go through our human resource committee so that they can ensure that the makeup of the board reflects the makeup of the community. And that's as close as we could get to saying diversity. We can't by law say, I want the board to be made up with 3 Black people, 4 women, 1 person from the LGBT community, and 2 Latinx people. But the closest that we could get in legal terms is to say that it would reflect the diversity of the community. We also went back and changed the scope of things that the Citizen Review Board could hear. Before, it could not hear racial profiling. And we don't use the word racial profiling because that pretty much just connotes Black, white, maybe Latinx. The word we use now and changed it to is called arbitrary profiling. So that means perceived gender, religion, race, color, ethnicity. But profiling cases could not be heard by the Citizen Review Board, so we changed and added that. We also added the Citizen Review Board to have the power to make recommendations, which it's used a couple times right after Keith Lamont Scott. For the first time, the board gave 12 recommendations to the police department that they wanted to see executed. And since then, they've issued their own reports again. So even though we haven't gotten where we wanted, we've made some changes over the year to the Citizen Review Board to where now we have had instances where the Citizen Review Board has ruled against officers and for the plaintiff. So that's on the oversight piece. But our main struggle for the past 4 or 5 years has been grappling with what Reverend Rhetoric was talking about, and how do you take a system that was built out of oppression and set to where there's never going to be a time that we can see that the police department's ever going to be one that the community has faith in. And actually, when we look at law enforcement and what Robert Peel invented law enforcement for in England, it does not fit the model anymore. Now, the police department, besides for having a history of oppression, is also burdened with things that are better handled by the community instead of the police department. The police department now has become a clearinghouse for dealing with traffic congestion, mental illness, schools, counseling, things that police officers, no matter how much we add another hour of training onto at the academy, it's not the role of policing, and there's better ways to spend taxpayers' money than looking at just funding police. So, as Reverend Rhetoric said, we were able to get a committee formed, which is the Safe Communities Committee, which is made up of the Clergy Coalition, also some people of faith that may not have actually been in that on that committee, but still houses of faith, NAACP, ACLU, radio DJs, school teachers, some professors. And we're not just talking about progressives, we're also talking about, since it has to reflect Charlotte, also conservatives. And we bring suggestions back to city council from this clearinghouse of groups for them to take up and look at police accountability. a few of the things on our side, the progressive side, we came up with a laundry list of things, but there were a few things that we were like really passionate about that you have to do. So one, we had to go back and ensure that the police department is handling basic human rights before we could even get to the point of other things. So we had passed back in 2015 something we call the Civil Liberties resolution that added protections for not being able to be filmed. We went with consent, and instead of just doing consent to search forms, once we got body cameras, we require that all stops be recorded, and then actual video and verbal consent is given by video so that we can see and lawyers can see at that time to make sure that the person isn't under duress, that they actually know their rights and get recorded. And we added in arbitrary profiling in those, but there was quite a few things that were still left. And some of those under the basic protections that we still didn't see was shooting into motor vehicles, which raised its head again. I know we got a lot of people that were mad saying, why y'all spending your time working on 8 Can't Wait? And, our point was we was working on this before it was 8 Can't Wait. We was working on this when it was 32 points that can't wait. And we got most of them passed, but there's still some things we need to clear up. And some of those included what was in 8 Can't Wait: shooting into a motor vehicle, a moving vehicle, duty to intervene. And there was like one other piece that Charlotte was not in compliance for. And at the time, the police department pretty much lied and said, "Oh yeah, we're in 100% compliance," and they weren't. And we had to keep on and keep on until the police chief had to admit, no, maybe we do need to change the language that we have. Oh, also chokeholds, which we've changed that language all around, because when we got to chokeholds, it's all on because this is where policy is. Policy's on the ifs, the thens, and the others, and how it's written. And the way ours was written, a chokehold was covered, but chokeholds mean that you put your hands around the back of the person's neck and you squeeze. It doesn't mean that you're stopped from squeezing on the sides of the neck, because then instead of cutting off ventilation, you're cutting off circulation of air going to the brain. So we had to go back and we had to work on those, even though the community was saying, "Oh, it's not important." I think when the case happened in Eastern North Carolina, they see now why we were so big on shooting into motor vehicles. But bigger than that, we started work with, of course, the people like Glency and all on what can we do to, and we don't use the word defund, we use on what powers can we return back to the people. And the reason we do that is because the word defunding just got to be so muttered down that the whole discussions was on defund and should it be called defund. Ours is like, what powers can we return back to the people, that the agreement for them to be safe and be governed don't have to be included in it. So we start looking at what that would look like. One of the things that we originally saw was with the murder rate in Charlotte, that calls to service, not murder, just murder, but the violent crime rate, calls to service is something that the police have to spend a lot of their time on. A lot of that we can reallocate. Instead of it being police that are responding and trying to keep the community safe, the community can keep its own self safe if funded to do violence interruption programming, because the police are always getting there late at the end anyway, and the person's already been harmed. What can we do to work on preventing the harm so that you don't have to have the calls to service? So one of the big things we pushed for was violence intervention program, in which the city will hopefully have started in August, so that the community is working on this violence instead of the police department. Another thing that we looked at is how do we limit the amount of interaction with the police on small misdemeanor and especially mental health calls. So we called to replace police on 911 calls that were broken windows type policing calls and mental health calls. And we got that, which should be starting in August as a pilot on Betty's Ford Road. So before we had what's called crisis response. We've had that for years, but it was crisis response was always a police officer and a clinician. But now we're going to remove the police from it, and it's going to be a clinician and an EMS worker or a firefighter that's responding to the 911 call. And the reason that's important is twofold. One is because we don't think that the police should be handling these calls because, it's just not what they do, and it leads to situations of violence. But secondly, once you remove the police, then it's no longer a criminal offense. It's a medical emergency. And those calls and stuff are handled under, those are part of your HIPAA record. So instead of getting a police record, it's handled under a medical situation where you're getting referral to help and you don't have a record. Minus the fact that there's still the possibility of what's called a involuntary commitment, which Ms. Sullivan probably knows about. And we're working those parts out too, because an involuntary commitment, even though not a criminal record, can be perceived by the person experiencing a mental episode as being the same thing as a arrest. But we're working through that. So that's two. One, how can we put violence and community building in the hands of the community and not this made up term community policing, which has not worked. Let's return that power to the community. Second, let's remove all calls for things like violence, for misdemeanors and mental health calls from the police and put it actually in the hands of trained mental health people, because the only thing that happens now is you get arrested, you go downtown, you've got to bail yourself out. And then when you go see the judge is going to give you a referral for the mental health that you need anyway. So let's remove the police from that and go straight for the mental instead of the arrest. Third piece was, before we can really talk about what can we do to cut the police department, we also need an accurate account on what the police spend. And that's why we contracted with Rand Corporation to do the first extensive audit. The city doesn't like the word audit. They like the word review, but review, audit, whatever you want to call it, on how much does it cost for calls to service? How many calls of service do you have for X in this neighborhood versus that neighborhood? How much money and how much time does an officer spend on traffic? Because if he's spending 5% of his time on traffic and answering calls on Independence Road because of broke down cars, we can replace that with a service like CVS traffic service at a fraction of the cost for the officer, and it's freeing the officer up for other stuff. But what we do know is that we can replace the officers on traffic things, then we replace one of the largest pieces of bad interactions with police that lead to violence. So if the police no longer have to pull over when your car is broke down, or if the police no longer are checking on your tags and your title, then you have less interactions with police. And it's sure to cost a lot less money to contract that out than to pay for a police officer to be tied up for 40 minutes on the side of a road and a $150,000 cruiser wearing $6,000 worth of machinery. Like Batman, or we could have just outsourced that to AAA, had the car moved for $45 instead of $6,500. But what I do see is that on the activism side, and the activism side is what we need, this is what keeps things going. Our job is different. Our job is to what can we see that we can get to achieve the goals that we want, but maybe not get caught down and bogged down in the part that the activists are doing such a good job. So, I spent 3 months before we got the commission started explaining to people defund versus abolish versus whatever, but I never could get people to move from just that argument to let's come up with a plan on what it looks like. Because what happens with the city is people go and they say, we want you to remove this money from the police and give it to some other body, and that's going to fix the problem. Well, it's not. Well, it's not going to fix the problem because
1, 2, 3, 4. There's no one on.
What's it about?
yeah. Well, it's not.
Bob, you're not
Hey.
on. Hello.
Hey, Bob Phillips.
Hello.
Hey, how are
Okay.
you?
Yeah, but we spend a lot of time on the ideology, and the ideology was, well, remove the money from the police department. Okay, we'll remove it. What are we removing? What services are we going to cut from the police to give? People don't want to spend time on that. We just want to take the money and give it to somewhere else. But that's not how a budget works. It's not like the city says, oh, here's $100 billion and we're going to divide it up evenly. No, every year, every department comes and says, I need 40 million and I need 30 million. Well, you can't go and say, I'm going to take, oh, police, you wanted 40 million and over here you wanted 20 million. Well, let's take 20 of your million and give it over to them. That's not how things work. What we have to show is there's an actual way to not have them have to have that money. So that's why we said, let's start looking at what services we can cut. I also think people forget that all systems are systems of oppression. So just saying I'm going to cut $40 million out of the police budget and I'm going to give it to transportation, well, that don't work because transportation is oppressive too. The bus don't stop on black sides of town where you want. Light rail's not going there. So why would I take the money from the police and give it to them? I just wouldn't take the money. That's our bigger concern. And how do we come up with the services to be able to be replaced? And I know this isn't a model for everywhere, but Charlotte's got a lot of money. It's not like, I know when the defund movement comes from a lot of cities and they say we're strapped for cash and the city's in charge of schools, I need to take money from the police department and give it to the schools because they don't have enough to open. Well, Charlotte's pretty rich. Our schools get $200 billion a year, and they've never had a shortage of money. Our transportation gets the money. So it's not an issue of shorting somebody out of money. It's an issue of how can I refine the role of policing to where it doesn't include us. But there's also a back part that us on the policy side have to pay attention to that goes a little further than activism. If I replace this system without making laws and passing laws that whoever's in charge of our law enforcement will be, then we're still going to be in the same position. So what we codify now for the police will carry over to once the police are replaced. But you also have to realize if you're replacing police with a system that's going to be neighborhood based and all of that, that neighborhood's going to have already been built to be strong to carry that out and to function it. And if oppression and bigotry and racism still exist, then whatever your replacement for with the police is going to be the same thing. Because even though us in a poorer black neighborhood will come up with our own system of how we want to be policed, I guarantee you that in Dilworth, Myers Park, and South Park, their version is going to be their own private police. And if you don't have control over this police, wait till you have 15 different neighborhoods with 15 different private police that are responsible to next door app instead of responsible to you. And then you go back to the day before there was standard police, and you go back to the old sheriff model to where people deputized folks, put them on the back of the truck, and we go and hunt down black people that they don't think should be in Dilworth, and you don't have no say in it. So there's always externalities, unintended consequences that we also have to look at and plan for. So I know I've talked for a while. I'm going to be quiet, but that's where we are right now.
Oh, no problem. You answered pretty much most of the questions that I have already. It was pretty much answered between you and Reverend Redrick. But I do have a few more. You touched on a lot of what we plan to go over. Thank you for that. What would you say to people who believe that police need more money for training and equipment?
Yeah, so again, what we have to do is figure out why would the police need more money? And right now they can't justify it. So it's not just saying, oh, I don't think the police should have it. It's why we call for this review. Show me and justify to me why you need the extra money. So if Charlotte is 1,800, and I think now we're up to 2,100 sworn, and we've got a vacancy rate at the CMPD of we're like 400 officers short. You don't need any more money to hire officers. You got the money because you didn't spend the money from the last time because you're not up to your 400 people potential. Why do you have to buy police cars at $80,000? I mean, people don't ask the questions. They just say, nah, and you're going to come up on the losing end. Our job is to say, how much does the police car cost? 80,000. 80,000? Or do we have to use a Ford? Can we get a Hyundai? What can we get that's going to cost less? Do we have to have an $80,000 car? You know, we've had to question things like tasers before. We had to change the tasers that they used in Charlotte because they were at such a high voltage that people got killed. So we were like, no, you shouldn't be spending this much money on tasers. When we're looking at what we won't cut. It can't be a general statement. It has to be a line item by line item statement, and it has to be why we are saying that the police don't need that money. And that was why we pushed so hard to bring in Rand Corporation to review all of CMPD's spending versus effectiveness from answering calls to service and answering other things. So we can come back at the end of that and say, it really looks like y'all are spending 32% of your time on traffic calls. We need to take traffic away from you and save that money. And when we move this argument off of just an ideological defund argument to that, then the Republicans have to come along with you. We were able to cut 67,000 calls for service from Charlotte with the Republican support because it got down to be what Republicans want to hear. Aren't y'all against big government? Aren't y'all against spending money that you don't have to spend? Well, we're looking right here at 67,000 calls to service that would save the taxpayers probably, $100 million. I mean, as a Republican, isn't that where you would stand? And they have to say, well, yeah, you're right. I love the police, but if they're costing me too much money, they got to go too.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Reverend Redrick.
I think Robert has pretty much spoken for me as well. When we think about reallocating dollars, and that's what I call it, because that's really what we're talking about. And we're looking at using the example for training. Before we give money towards training, I think it also needs to be examined, what is the training? What I have found is that the training that is supposed to be modernized, if you will, still has all of the trappings of the 1900s, when policing came into existence, which, when we go back and do our history, as Robert so eloquently stated, it was primarily put in place based on slave trade, slave codes. So when you go back and you look at that history, you find that really nothing has changed. It's just evolved over time into a more egregious system of not caring or protecting. As Robert stated, when you look at the founder of policing in England and you compare it to what we see today, it never looked like what England's policing looked like. And when you go around the country and look at other forms of protecting and serving, you really see that. So when we talk about how we allocate dollars, and I know training is the big buzzword, because we think that it's training that's going to change the way policing looks. Changing the way policing looks starts with a mindset and an understanding that the basis of its creation was not to serve and protect everyone. It was to protect persons of color, property, i.e., but persons of color from property, and persons of color being treated as property. So when you think about law enforcement and how it looks at people as a Dr. Hugh, as Jane would say it, Jane Elliott would describe persons of a Dr. Hugh, we understand that we're not looked as human beings from the very beginning. So when you can not see me as a human being, then the treatment that you impart on me has no way of touching hearts, minds, and souls. So when we talk about training, we're not just talking about a skill set of how to handle a weapon and how to communicate. We're talking about a mindset. So when we want to reallocate dollars, we want to be able to allocate dollars that are going to address these issues. Having been a part of the first cohort for the Charlotte City Academy, and I can't remember all of the acronym and the name, one of the things that our group was exposed to was a day at the at the police academy and looking at the films. And when you show films that specifically speak to a particular demographic and how you police, and then you put that individual out on the street, when it's biased to the very beginning, how do you expect that officer to be on the street and see differently from what they have been trained? So we recognize, at least I recognize, and I'm sure some of my peers did, recognize that the system, number one, let's be clear, the system is designed to do exactly what it's doing. So we need to educate around that. And two, we need to look at how those dollars are dispersed, as Robert so eloquently discussed. So when we can sit down and really do that from a lens of humanity, I believe that we can achieve what we want. And the pushback on reallocating dollars, because once again, it goes back to semantics and words, reallocating those dollars so that the community as a whole is able to benefit from the real service that law enforcement is supposed to do. We know that communities are viewed differently, understood differently, where one community is looked upon as it's a health concern, the other community is looking at it's a violent crime. So we need to take all of that into consideration. And I also want to add to the conversation, as Robert talked about policy work and advocacy work. We do have to work together in order to achieve the outcomes that we're looking for. And the best way to do that is to go alongside each other, us, the advocacy community, understanding what the policy community is doing, so that when we go out with a clear messaging. I think that that's also important as we talk about how can we look at this community differently. It's sad to say that the death of George Floyd had to bring us back to this. And Charlotte, we have had history, repeated history that we come back to it. But the difference between what has happened in Charlotte and what happened with Robert Floyd is that in a COVID context, the whole world, not just North Carolina, not just Minnesota, not just the United States, but the world had an opportunity to see, and I'm going to say this, to see the lie that we live. And so I think that it's important for us to recognize that both the advocacy community and those who are working to change policies keep that in our forefront, so that we are able to really achieve what it is that we need to do. We know that when we look across other countries that had some history, perhaps not as damaging as the history of these United States, but history just the same, recognize their issues and really took some serious action to change it. Everyone, I've looked at the statistics, I can't give you the numbers, but the United States kills more people than some of the other countries that you would expect to have a high rate in crime. And when you go back and you look at that on a comparative basis, you will find that their law enforcement looks totally different. They're not heavily armed. They don't have military type weaponry. They don't have any of that. And their crime rate is down. But we have all of these means of protection, if you will, that don't do anything but bring harm to a certain group of people. And when we look at the whole scope of that, we know that economics, capitalism is also a driver to what spikes crime.
Yeah. You know, the other thing that I would add is as we keep looking on ways to replace, people have to look more than just at a budget. Because normally what you're looking at is you're just looking at the city's operational budget. So when people look and they see that 240 million that Charlotte is spending, the majority of it is salary. And the other piece of it is pension. I mean, that makes up 90% of the budget. So just you're not going to defund that. What you've got to do is cut calls to service so that there isn't the need for police. But just cutting $1 here or $1 here is never going to hurt the police because it's always going to be justified. The majority of that money is for salary. And the part that I think really resonates, especially with conservatives, is pension. And that's where that money is going, not as much for services, but for employee salaries and for pensions. And the second piece to look, besides for just looking at just the operational budget, people have to look at how much money is being spent on bricks and mortar. If you look at Charlotte, Raleigh, Durham, they're building police stations. So if they're building a station, that means they plan to house them. But you're not finding that money in the operation budget. You're finding that money on the ballot. Every year, the police puts on your ballot, where do you want us to build police stations? So I have a whole bunch of people that go and vote and don't pay attention to the ballots. And they come back and I said, did you vote for the down ballot stuff like the Housing Trust Fund bond, for the cops funding? You know, I say cops like certificates of participation and things like that. And they'll be like, yeah, I voted for all of them. Well, you do know that on that, if you read it, it said to build in Charlotte 16 new police stations. But you're saying you want to defund them, but you just voted in favor of building them 16 new police stations because their whole attention is just spent on an operational budget. Charlotte's police department could function without the operational budget. They get so much money from the federal government. They get so much money from their own grant making that if the city of Charlotte was to say right now, we're going to cut you by $20 million, they're just going to make the $20 million up. I mean, it's that easy. Like, we wanted to attack how much money was being spent on police-run programming, like, the programs that they do in the community. None of that came from taxpayers' money. That was their money that they raised. So when folks say, why is the city contributing to PAL? Well, the city's not contributing to PAL. The police department's funding that out of the money that it gets. You know, we said now that Charlotte won't buy chemical agents. That says Charlotte won't buy chemical agents. It doesn't say that the police department can't go and take chemical agents directly from the manufacturer for free. I mean, these are the type of things that it's a bigger lift than just saying, let me take some money and give some money to another thing. You have to actually sit down and look at this. And that's why, like, I'm glad Bob Phillips is on the call. When we look at this, like in voting, or we look at this in education, we look at it bigger than just the budget. It's like, what do we need to do to make sure we got the right voting machines? What do we need to make sure that we've got the access? It isn't just, oh, let me hand Mecklenburg County Board of Elections more money, or they don't need this money, let's take it away. Because the system of oppression is still gonna work with or without the money if the people don't pull away the power. And right now, if Charlotte is having on Betty's Ford Road 3,000 calls to service a night, the people living on Betty's Ford themselves are not going to agree with you to abolish the police until we figured out a way to cut those calls to service because the community is handling it. You know, that's the whole thing. And we're out on the doors every day. And what people tell us is we don't want the police to shoot us. We want the police to treat us fair. But I'll tell you what, Robert, you're going to leave by 7 o'clock tonight and the hood come alive. And my neighbor got shot by my other neighbor. I got robbed 4 days ago. And I would have picked the 911 phone up and called somebody with a gun. And until people cannot see that, then it's our job. I like to preach the ideology, but we're a membership-based organization. And in poor neighborhoods, the average Black person in the neighborhood is not calling for the end of the police. They're calling for the end of the police treating them different. But, you know, that's something that we've got to make sure that people understand too. It sounds great in ideology until you've had your house broke into 6 times over the past few months. Your son that's in the house with you is in a wheelchair because he got shot. And your daughter has had run-ins with people robbing her. You know, they just do not believe that just out of the blue, starting tomorrow, you're going to come up with this neighborhood approach that, you know, hopefully we can get there. But until we reduce cost of service and show the people actually impacted by the neighborhood a real approach. And again, what I hear, and this isn't coming from me, the academic, it's coming from older Black people in my neighborhood. That when I would say we're going to abolish the police, and they say, well, you're still not going to abolish white supremacy, baby. You're just going to change the color and the picture of the badge. But as long
Right.
as Dilworth is rich and our neighborhood is poor, then Dilworth's just going to pay money out of their housing monthly dues to contract with Pinkerton, and Pinkerton's going to still be the police department.
Right, right. I think you said something very important, Robert, but it also goes back to educating. Educating what was meant by those who use the term defunding. I think really it was propaganda, perhaps from those who are not interested in changing how policing is done, to use that word, because anytime you hear defund, you think that something is going away, when clearly that was not the intent when that word was used. The intent was restructuring how it looks and how it operates. And in order for that to happen, it does take a closer eye. It is more than budgeting. As you know, as you have said, and as I have said, it's more than that. It's really the real word is dismantling the system of policing that was formulated in the 1900s. That's the real word. And of course, when you hear that, what are we saying? We're saying break apart, pull away the systems that the design, and realign the design so that it fits, so that when families in the Beatties Ford Road area need services, they're really getting services and not having a police officer arrive 14, 15, 20 cars pulling out their revolver and responding to the issue with a bullet in the back. So that's what we're talking about. So you're absolutely right. We're not saying.
We also get another piece of that too. It's really hard for me to talk about one system of oppression and cutting its funding when other systems of oppression I'm saying don't touch. So if you're poor and Black in Charlotte and the school system has failed you now for 35 straight years,
Exactly.
I can't keep coming back saying every year, let's give Charlotte Mecklenburg schools an additional 100 million. They're like, but it failed my kids, and y'all said y'all want to go fix it in the 80s. Then it failed my grandkids in the 90s. And it failed my great grandkids in 2000. And you want to cut money to the police, but you won't cut money to the school, and they suspend my son every other month. They won't let him have the textbooks that he needs, but you come around every year asking me to give money to him.
Yeah, I think it's what we said before we came on air when I mentioned the fact that all of this intersects. You cannot do one without doing the other, because everything that has been designed, and you said it over and over, is about oppression and suppression. So it is a mentality. I mean, when you think about what's going on with our education system now, and we saw it very clearly in Washington with the Secretary of Education, who made it possible for the public school systems to lose plenty of dollars that would assist families, Title I families. Well, who were they targeting? They were targeting people of Black and brown. They still are targeting people of Black and brown. While you provide Title I, you provide Title I with, it's handicapped. Title I cannot do all that it needs to do to be able to assist our kids. So you talk about education, but then we need to talk about sending a child to school that hasn't had a proper meal because mom is working at a job part-time because they don't want to hire her or him full-time, because that means that you would get medical benefits. So you don't have a job that's going to allow you to be the best possible parent you can be, although you are the best possible parent that you can be under the circumstances at which you're working. So as we said before we even came, came live, all that we're talking about intersects. So, you can't, it's like going to get your car fixed. They say that when you take care of getting one thing fixed, then you're going back because the new part, makes the old part break down even faster. So you're constantly putting the pieces together to get things to operate in the way that they need to be done. And that's why, as Robert stated, we need both. We need advocacy and we need policy. We need people who understand and recognize that all of the systems that are working the way they were designed. That's the first thing that we need to be honest about. We want to say the system is broken. No, it's not. The system is doing exactly what the system has been designed to do. Our jobs, advocacy, policy, persons, we need to come together and admit that the systems are not broken, they're fixed, and they're operating the way they should be. But then to be able to, one, own up to that, and two, look at ways to dismantle the system. And we know we can't dismantle it 100%, because if we do that, then what do we have? We're left with a greater chaos, which heightens policing, right? Because we're taking things away that are in place. So we have to be able to, one, design and dismantle at the same time. It's called biting that elephant off one piece at a time, but it also still has to work in a secular manner, that we're touching all of the spokes. I'm using a lot of imagery, but that we're touching all of the spokes in this oppressive wheel of systems that we are encountering. And so it's a heavy lift. It's not an easy job on either side of the gamut. And once we understand what is necessary to do the job and be willing, because a lot of us know what needs to be done, but we're not willing to do the work, because the work is extremely a heavy lift. And
Reverend, also how it ties back into what you work on all the time, and people say they don't really care about voting. I just gave,
that's what I'm saying.
I just gave
all
you
the way back.
I just gave you one example. Whether you go and vote or not, that police station is going to be on the ballot.
Exactly.
The money to purchase. Yeah.
I'm sorry, we have a few questions. I know Miss
Jean, you can't put us on the call at the same time.
She has been raising her hand for a while.
Okay, I'm going on mute.
It's fine. I just wanted to I know we're getting past our 7, so I just wanted to take a moment to get some questions.
Okay, I know we're out of time, but I've made a little list, and I'll just couch these in the frame of ideas. Okay, first and foremost, I've worked in mental health for over 60 years. We have to remember that our mental health system currently is the same model as in the 1860s. Okay, it started in 1955 and has never gotten better. It's totally inadequate for every kind of mental health you can think of. Secondly, are the police policies open to the public? Thirdly, I heard you say community policing did not work, but I wonder if it was because it wasn't a good model rather than it's a bad idea. And that I don't know whether we have people like community organizers anymore. I don't hear the term a lot. And I'm wondering if a system of community organizers that would be include the police, but also include other kinds of things would maybe be workable. Next, there is good bias testing available to all of us. And I'm wondering if recruits to the police academy are tested for various kinds of bias before they're hired. Thirdly, are we, about 6. Is our police department heavily armed with military vehicles? I don't know. So I think that's an interesting thing. And are there best practices, examples around the country that we need to bring into awareness of our citizenry so that we can borrow rather than try to reinvent everything? It just takes so much time to reinvent. But if there's best practice in policing, in housing, in relationships and so forth, why aren't we bringing those to the fore? That's my piece. Thank you for listening.
Well, you gave us a
Yeah,
whole
those are
bunch there,
awesome.
Miss. You gave us a whole bunch there, Miss Sullivan. I'll try to jump into a few.
Yes.
Community policing as an idea and an ideology may work, but in how it's carried out, if the calls for service are so high that they don't have time to do community service and community policing, and if the results from the calls to the service lead to the same officer that's coming around now to shake your hand after he beat your son on the corner the night before, then the model itself isn't going to work. So it works maybe on paper, but it only works. White neighborhoods have community policing. Mixed neighborhoods where I live have community policing. The police come down the street while I'm cutting grass and they blow the horn and wave, and sometimes they stop. We have a conversation. But if you're in our neighborhoods and you've got 240 calls to service, mainly because people are doing small stuff that you shouldn't be responding to anyway, loitering, this, that, the other. You may call yourself community policing, but you're not really doing it. So it's not the ideology is bad, but it's always going to be hard to pull off in practice. As far as best practices, there are a lot of things that we look at here in America that are still in the stages. You know, we modeled this mental health program after a program in Portland, Oregon called Cahoots, which has been around for 30 years with instead of police responding, it's a clinician and an EMS or whatever. It's been successful for 30 years. And now, before we started, Denver started it. It's called STAR in Denver. And they started their program a year and a half ago. And it's been renewed because of the success and the amount of calls to service that they're answering and getting people help. Violence interruption is up and down. Cure Violence is who we're using. Reverend Rhetoric's from Chicago, where Cure Violence is from. You know, they invented this public health
Not from.
methodology.
Not from, lived there, but not from.
Oh, we live there.
Mhm.
They invented this whole public health methodology that's proved successful if people always implement the methodology, Ms. Sullivan, if that makes sense. The methodology over time gets co-opted. Like, again, nothing about the pastors, but like in Baltimore, it stopped working because they contracted out all of the work because the pastors was powerful. But the pastors decided, we're going to do Cure Violence, but we're going to change it to this other methodology. And they didn't follow the methodology. In Chicago, the neighborhoods that Cure Violence goes in and does, it works and reduces homicides by like 30%. But after 2 years of it being reduced, and the city says, why are we spending the money on it? And they cut it. And then 4 years later, they have to come back because that was the only thing that worked. And they did it again recently. It's like every time that New York, Chicago, or those, it works, they decide, well, that's fixed. It's not fixed because it's community building.
How stupid can we be?
Yeah, and again, I'll let you go, but Reverend Rhetoric hit on something. There are policing models that we need to look at that have been carried on for years in France and Great Britain and all of these. And there, I know our mental health system, and I'm not an expert in it, but I think that the police never became in charge of mental health, which was the issue here. And now that I'm in my 50s, I'm old enough to remember when there was mental like facilities. And I remember by the time that I was a kid, like, you know, early 80s, people started being less of them. And then by the 90s, there was few. And then I remember when I came to Charlotte, they closed like the last one. What was it, Charter something?
Charter Pines.
Charter Pines,
Yeah.
they closed it.
In the
So
time I've been in Charlotte, they started and stopped two psychiatric hospitals.
Yeah. So it all became, if you have a mental issue, the police are going to deal with you.
And you're going to
But
jail.
I will tell you this too. The person that integrated South Carolina, University of South Carolina. Harvey Gantt did Clemson. It was 3 that did South Carolina, where I'm from. And one of the main people that helped pull that off is this woman from South Carolina named Majeska Simpkins. And when you go around South Carolina Black community, you'll hear her name a lot. Her biggest fight wasn't police or affordable housing or any of that. It was the treatment of people in the mental institution. So this is before my time, but South Carolina has a street called Bull Street. And there was a mental institution there, but at the time it was called the South Carolina, I guess back in the 40s, Sanitarium. And the treatment that poor and Black people got in the facility rivaled torture. You know what I mean?
It was terrible.
And it made it to the point that by the time you got to my grandparents and my parents' age, mental thing, folks would say, I would rather go to the jail than you go and lock me up in that mental facility. So I also know that there's got to be a whole bunch of work done on the mental. For one, building a structure that people can live in, like Reverend Rederick was saying, it's going to have to be reformed too, because people believe that you go, they shoot you up all day and put you in a corner. And, you know, folks will say, I would rather go to jail than for you to put me on 5 pieces of medication and just roll me into a corner.
Yeah, well, you know, they did lobotomies, experimentation, all types of cruelty. But if you go back and look during the Reagan administration, that's when a lot of those services were cut, and you were putting more persons who had mental diseases, diseases in jails and on the streets. So, you know, as we say before, everything is interconnected, because what was working in one state, you know, the president at that time thought that all states were doing the same thing. So, you know, federal government did not need to participate in that. The same thing that happened with housing, because one state was doing it, the mindset was, well, every state is doing it. So, you know, we can cut those dollars. So some
also,
of it
like Reverend Rederick, what you do, when we started really seeing, and Tent City wasn't really on my radar, but at the end, people really rushed, meaning well, and saying, we're going to get these people an apartment, or we're going to make sure that they eat. When we were out there, and again, I'm not a mental health professional, but I would say 30% of the people, the city's trying to fix their housing and they're trying to fix whatever, but some of these people have deep mental issues that just because people are complaining, we're going to put you in an apartment. But if you're not capable of taking care of yourself, you're not going to have the apartment, I mean, the hotel room, but a week.
That's true.
And they went back right out on the street, and everybody was still concerned about why are they back on the street? Because the person has a mental issue, and instead of it being a Mecklenburg County social service person, you just turned them over to a pay by the week hotel. They could care less.
Exactly.
Yeah, definitely.
Exactly.
Well, thank you all both. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Reverend Rederick, for being here. Jenny, I just want to make sure, or Bob, if you all have any questions.
I did it all.
Okay. I was just going to ask next, how can people get involved and be involved and stay involved with what you all are doing? Because even with this, I'm still going to reach out and email folks and let them know how they can be involved.
I think the most important thing we said tonight is to recognize that it's not just a problem that is impacting one singular thing, that if we look at all of the ways that everything connects, and as Robert stated, which is one of my mantras, is that it's all connected to the power of the vote. Educating persons to understand that it's not our politicians who have the power, it's we, the citizens, who have the power, and we need to be able to exercise that. But in order to exercise it properly, we need to be educated. So we need to know, as Robert, the example that Robert used, whenever those bond items, that little box, it's a little tiny box with the little fine writing at the end of you're answering all the questions that have the big box with the big names that you can read, that it's that kind of educating that we need to understand. And when we understand that where those dollars are going, then you're able to also reflect that, did any of that money go into my community as the little tiny writing said it would do? And if the money did not do what it said it was going to do, if it did not impact housing like it said it was going to do, if it did not impact education the way it said it was going to do, then the box needs to be checked no. So we need to be able to, really take an educational approach to what's on the ballot, who's running on the ballot, what particular position that they are running for, how long they're in position, how that position impacts your daily life. When we begin to take all of that seriously, then the conversation that you invited both Robert and me here tonight will have a different type of outcome. It requires advocacy. It requires understanding the policies. It also requires that when Mecklenburg County has a meeting and you're able to go, that you're there. When the city council has a meeting, you go. When your community needs an issue, when your community has an issue, where do we go? You want to be able to have that. And you want to be able to know that, hey, there's a Robert Dawkins that you can call. There's a Reverend Glency Redrick that you can call, because we are out here doing the work. And we need more people to understand that the work is not going to get done with just the two of us and our groups and other groups that we that we partner with, because we're two people, but believe you me, we are thousands of people when we pull folks together. But if you're coming together and not knowing why you're coming together, it really defeats the purpose of the outcomes that we're looking for. So
Yep.
get
And also,
involved, but get
and
educated.
also, you don't have to go to everything. And that's what I see the people do and they get burnt out. So that's Reverend Rhetoric, that's like our job. And it's not just us, we have people that we work with, and got Steph got all of that. But if you're concerned, Miss Sullivan, about mental issues, then that's the part that's the county and DSS. Concentrate the little bit of time you have at all of the Mecklenburg County meetings that have, you said you're partially retired. So those 2:00 Mecklenburg County mental health discussions, you're being there to hear, send back to the bureaucrats and the politicians your input on, I heard you say this, and I don't think that's going to work. That's how we organize. We don't have to have all these paid organizers. We have to have people willing to give some of their time. And I always hear from people that they don't have the time, but then they come back and they tell me what they heard on MSNBC from the 5:00 show, the 6:00 show, the 7:00 show, the 8:00 show. Al Sharpton still got a show at night in the L's at 9. So you had 4 hours to listen to MSNBC to prepare for a fight with a Republican that you're never gonna have, when you could have spent an hour of that at the city council meeting. And the good thing about, if you're in Charlotte, Raleigh, Durham, Greensboro, Fayetteville, you don't even have to be there. It's live. It's on your computer. It's on your TV.
2:00 when? 2:00 when?
Well, no, you just have to look. I made that name up.
Oh,
But
okay.
all
Yeah,
of the county
go to the county website and
you'll look and you'll see, and it might be, and it'll be that committee that handles mental health, and their meeting might be Tuesday at 11:00.
And
Most
can
people,
observers come to your meetings?
oh yes, ma'am. You can come to our meeting. You can definitely go to the government meeting.
Can I get on your mailing list?
Yeah, you can definitely get on our mailing list. So I mean, if you send
and
something,
Glency.
you send something to Robert at actionnc.org and put this as Miss Sullivan. I'll respond back. It'll be, hey, Miss Sullivan, this is Robert.
.org.
.org.
Okay, and Glency, yours is just ministers, right? Clergy.
Well, whenever we Gather, Charlotte Clergy Coalition is ministers only, but we do call the committee the community when we have our rallies and our press conferences. So I just put my email in there. Whenever I receive your email, I'll add you to my database. And that way you're able to be informed when we take any kind of action. Currently, Charlotte Clergy Coalition for Justice, along with the Poor People's Campaign and Transformative Justice Coalition, our main thrust right now is making sure that we get those 3 bills in the Senate passed, because as I said to Robert, all this great conversation that we had tonight will pale in comparison if we don't have those 3 bills passed. And so we make sure to be able to show the intersectionality of the importance of those 3 bills being passed. Also looking at also Democracy North Carolina, when we think about the egregious bills that our legislators are trying to pass now, there's a bill now, I don't have the number, and Robert may know the bill number, House bill, proposed House bill number. See, Robert, I'm having my education right and how to state it. But it's called Jim Crow 2.0, where you're talking about when three persons gather, because there's not defined language. 3 people can be gathering, having a calm conversation, but if that bill passes, law enforcement can come by and say, oh, you're inciting a riot, and then you are arrested with a felony. So we want to keep our ears to the pavement, so that not only our feet, but our ears, because a lot of stuff that we miss because we're not paying attention, and because they loop little stuff like that into other bills where, once again, the big print is what you want, the little print is what they want. And when we miss the little print, we end up saying yes to some stuff that does more harm than good. So that my email address is in the chat. Thank you so much, Jenny and Bob.
I'll be in touch as well, Jenny, making sure you're involved. I know Robert and I know Reverend Redrick as well, and a lot of the things that they are involved in. So I'll be in touch with you as well, just making sure you're staying in the know of what's going on in Charlotte.
Great.
Well, y'all have a good night.
Yes, thank you all. I appreciate you all being here tonight. And
Thank you.
You all have a good night.